So, you know, fairly disappointingly, Bethany Beach does not actually have any water. What do you think happened to the water? Was there ever water here? Probably, yes. Yeah. So these sand dunes actually formed on the margins of Glacial Lake Peterborough, which was one of the kind of ephemeral lakes that had formed during the last ice retreat. So as the ice was retreating and melting, there were a number of different lakes that formed and disappeared. Lake Peterborough was one of them, and the sand was deposited in that lake. Now, how do you think that we got the dunes? How did dunes form? What do we require? Wind. So wind and waves within the lake to push the sand around. Now, if you have a look at the deposit here, you can see that it's pretty much entirely composed of fine-grained sand. So, is this well graded or poorly graded?
Poorly graded. Poorly graded,
well sorted. Excellent. That's great. So it seems kind of odd when you look around that there's all of this vegetation behind and around us, and then there is this exposed area of sand. And so it's kind of interesting how this sandy area came to be exposed. European settlers, when they came here, they brought their sheep, their cattle, their goats, their chickens, all of the things that they needed to establish a new life here. And they cut down a lot of trees to establish grazing. Now that's pretty typical. That's happened everywhere around the world. One of the things that cutting down trees does is degrade the soil beneath it, because you're not having all of those organic contributions to the soils that you would have had if you continued to leave the forest there, if the trees were still growing and dying and decomposing. So they got rid of the trees, they planted some grass, and then they let their livestock out upon it. Some of the stock that they brought over, sheep, have a pretty significant impact on grassland. They actually crop it very, very closely. And it doesn't leave much in the way of grass, doesn't leave much in the way of roots, and so it makes the soil, again, more susceptible to the processes of weathering and erosion. Now this area, and actually a big chunk of North America, was subject to drought in the early 20th century. The grass died, the winds blew away all of the soil, and the sand plain here was exposed. So that was about 85, 90 years ago. You would think that maybe some mediation or some kind of remediation, some kind of mitigation had happened, and that this would start growing over again. And in fact, some of it has. If you look at the trees on the other side of the road there behind the bus, those are all plantation pines. So they were planted to try and mitigate the effects of erosion in this area. But there are a number of reasons why this has never really regenerated. Can anybody, just based on what you can see around you, make any suggestions as to why that might be?
Human activity.
Human activity. What kind of human activity?
ATVs, trucks.
ATVs, trucks, dirt bikes, those kinds of things. So this area is pretty heavily used for recreation purposes. Also, people come in and take the sand for sand pits at home. So there hasn't really been much of an opportunity for things to regenerate around here. But in nature, things regenerate generally very well and pretty impressively considering what they're starting with. And so this area here is an example of something called secondary succession. And we're going to be looking at succession in a few weeks' time in lab. And what succession is the process by which something like this, which is essentially a sterile, barren wasteland, becomes something that is fertile and living and supports other life forms. So if you look at the edges around here, what you'll see is that we've got some quite complex plants. As we move closer to this sort of more sterile area in the middle, you can see that the vegetation gets a bit less complex. We've got some grasses and some weeds and some very low shrubs. And then eventually we get out into this area with nothing. And what happens during the process of succession is that something called a pioneer plant or pioneer species, and those are grasses, weeds, in the case of areas that have barren rock, lichens and mosses, start to establish. And as they die, they contribute organic material to the environment, and they start creating soil. So rocks and minerals start to break down, organic matter gets added, and there is the creation of soil. Soil can support more complex plants, and once we have sort of a much more complicated plant-based ecosystem around us, then animals can survive and thrive in these regions as well. We're also going to be looking at primary succession. That is where you have a complete obliteration of the environment and things have to start from scratch. This, as I said, is an example of secondary succession. So we can take a look and compare the edges. We can see that in the middle here we've basically got sterile quartz sand, nothing but SiO2, silica oxide. On the edges we've got the beginnings of a soil profile moving out into a more complex ecosystem on the fringes. So what I would like you to do for the next few minutes before we get back onto the bus and head home is take a look at these edges, take a look at the soil profiles, see how things are developing, make some notes about your observations. Think about this in terms of the glacial environment. So was this a water contact or an ice contact feature?
Water.
It's a water contact feature. Do you think it was close to the glacier or was it further away?
Further away.
It's a little bit further away. Something like this with fine-grained sand that is well sorted, poorly graded, was deposited in a fluvial environment that was not particularly vigorous. So take a look at those features, and then I will give you a call in a few minutes and we'll hop back on the bus.